The train platform fell silent the moment Caleb Hawthorne unfolded himself from the railcar. 6 feet and 7 inches of hope and heartbreak, stepping into spring sunshine that suddenly felt too bright, too exposing. He searched the crowd for her face, the woman whose letters had promised a new beginning. When their eyes finally met, hers went wide with something between shock and horror. She took one step back, then another. The whispers started before she even spoke the words that would shatter everything. "I'm sorry, I can't. You're just too much." If you want to see how Caleb transforms his greatest rejection into his greatest strength, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city, so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Missouri countryside rolled past the train window in waves of green and gold, each mile carrying Caleb Hawthorne further from everything he'd known and closer to a future built entirely on faith. He'd read Margaret Sutherland's letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, her careful handwriting promising companionship, partnership, a place where a man could build something lasting. She'd described the growing town of Cottonwood Ridge, the opportunities for someone willing to work hard, the life they might create together. What she hadn't asked about, what Caleb had carefully avoided mentioning, was exactly how much space he took up in the world. At 6'7", Caleb had learned early that his height made people uncomfortable. Not in the obvious ways, not with outright cruelty, but in the small adjustments that spoke louder than words. The way folks stepped aside a little too quickly in narrow spaces. How conversations died when he entered a room, as if his presence disrupted some natural order. The careful neutrality in voices that said, "My goodness, you're tall," while eyes said something altogether different. His mother, rest her soul, had told him he was a blessing. "The world needs strong men," she'd whispered during those last fevered nights before the consumption took her. His father had been more practical. "Make yourself useful, boy. That's how men like us earn our place." So Caleb had made himself useful. He'd worked twice as hard as anyone else, kept his voice quiet, his movements careful. He'd learned to make himself smaller in every way except the one that actually mattered. And when the war came, he'd served, grateful, initially, that the army at least valued what his body could do. Until he'd taken a bullet through the shoulder at Shiloh and come home to find his father's shop sold, the new owners uninterested in a carpenter who couldn't swing a hammer for 6 months. The mail-order bride agency had seemed like Providence. A chance to start over somewhere. No one knew him. No one had already decided what he was worth. Margaret's letters had been kind, practical, focused on the future rather than the past. She'd mentioned she was 32, older than most women seeking husbands through such arrangements, and that she valued stability over romance, partnership over passion. Caleb could offer stability. He could offer partnership. Romance and passion seemed like luxuries for men who didn't have to think about doorways and chair sizes and the way their shadow could swallow a whole room. The train whistle cut through his thoughts, that long, mournful note that meant arrival. Caleb stood carefully, mindful of the low ceiling, and gathered his belongings. A worn canvas bag holding everything he owned, a toolbox that had been his father's, and the small wooden box containing Margaret's letters tied with string. Through the window, Cottonwood Ridge materialized from the prairie dust. It was larger than he'd expected, a proper town with a main street, actual storefronts, church steeples rising against the pale spring sky. The kind of place with enough people that maybe, just maybe, a man could find his corner and not be constantly noticed. The platform was crowded with the usual chaos of train arrivals, families reuniting, merchants collecting shipments, children darting between adults' legs. Caleb descended the steps slowly, aware of every eye that tracked his movement. He set his bags down and scanned the crowd, looking for the face that had smiled from the single photograph Margaret had sent months ago. He spotted her near the station house, partially obscured by a cluster of well-dressed women. Even in the photograph, Margaret Sutherland had looked proper, polished, with dark hair pinned severely back and eyes that suggested intelligence rather than warmth. In person, she was exactly as advertised, handsome rather than pretty, dressed in a deep blue traveling suit that spoke of means and taste. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He picked up his bags and started toward her, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The crowd seemed to part before him, not out of courtesy he'd learned long ago, but instinct, the way people moved aside for a loaded wagon or a spooked horse. "Miss Sutherland?" His voice came out rougher than intended, dust and nerves combining. Margaret turned, and Caleb watched the sequence of emotions cross her face with the sick familiarity of someone who'd seen it before. Initial neutrality giving way to surprise. Surprise hardening into something between shock and, worse, embarrassment. Mr. Hawthorne. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in propriety. Yes, ma'am. I'm pleased to finally— You're extremely tall. The words dropped like stones into water, creating ripples of silence that spread through the surrounding crowd. Caleb felt his face heat. Yes, ma'am, I am. I apologize that I didn't— An apology doesn't change the fact. Margaret's voice had gone crisp, clipped. The women flanking her had gone quiet, watching with the avid attention of spectators at a public humiliation. I don't know what you expected, Mr. Hawthorne, but I cannot— She stopped, drew herself up straighter. This is not at all what I anticipated. Miss Sutherland, I understand this is a surprise, but if we could perhaps speak privately. There's nothing to discuss. Margaret's cheeks had gone pink, but her voice remained steady. I requested a husband, not a spectacle. Look at you. You're enormous. How do you expect me to walk beside you, to introduce you to my friends, my family? Good Lord, what would people say? Each word landed like a blow. Caleb had prepared himself for many possible reactions, but the naked mortification in Margaret's voice, the way she seemed to physically recoil from his presence, cut deeper than he'd expected. I'm the same man who wrote you those letters, he said quietly. The same man you corresponded with for 6 months. The man in those letters failed to mention he was built like a circus attraction. Margaret's voice rose slightly, losing some of its careful control. You deceived me, Mr. Hawthorne. Whether by omission or intent, you deceived me. I never lied to you. Caleb heard the edge creeping into his own voice and fought to control it, drawing attention, making a scene. That would only make everything worse. I told you I was a carpenter, that I was strong, that I could provide— You failed to mention the most obvious fact about yourself. Margaret glanced at the women beside her, as if drawing strength from their presence. I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm sure you're a decent man in other respects, but this arrangement cannot proceed. I simply cannot accept a husband who would make me appear ridiculous by comparison. The world seemed to narrow to that single platform, that single moment. Behind Caleb, he could hear the train preparing for departure, the hiss of steam, the conductor's call. Around them, conversations had stopped. People were staring now, without pretense, watching the tall stranger get rejected like a poorly made dress returned to the shop. I have nowhere else to go, Caleb said, hating the note of desperation that crept into his voice. I sold everything to come here. Those letters. You said you wanted someone steady, someone reliable. I can be those things, Miss Sutherland. I can be whatever you need. Something flickered across Margaret's face. Pity, perhaps, or guilt. But it hardened quickly back into resolution. What I need, Mr. Hawthorne, is a husband I can be proud to stand beside, not one I have to explain or apologize for. She reached into her handbag and pulled out an envelope. Here. This should cover your return ticket and a few nights' lodging until you can make other arrangements. Caleb didn't take the envelope. I don't want your money. Then consider it reimbursement for your trouble. Margaret set the envelope on top of his toolbox, her movements precise and final. I truly am sorry, but some things simply cannot work, no matter how much we might wish them to. She turned away then, her friends clustering around her like protective hens, their whispers sharp and carrying in the spring air. Caleb heard fragments, can you imagine, absolutely towering. Poor Margaret, as they swept away across the platform, leaving him standing alone with his bags and the envelope of money that felt like the final nail in a coffin he'd been building his entire life. The platform gradually came back to life around him. People returned to their business with that particular kind of aggressive normalcy that said they'd witnessed something uncomfortable and wanted to forget it quickly. The train pulled away in a cloud of steam and smoke, taking with it any easy escape. Caleb stood there for a long moment, toolbox in hand, watching dust devils dance across the empty tracks. He should feel something, he thought. Anger, maybe. Humiliation. The urge to get on the next train and leave this place behind. Instead, he felt mostly tired. And beneath the tiredness, something harder and colder, a bone-deep understanding that this was simply how the world worked. Some men got to build lives. Others just took up too much space. You planning to root there permanent, son, or you gonna let other folks through? Caleb turned to find an older man in station master's clothes regarding him with neither sympathy nor hostility, just practical irritation. Behind him, a family waited with luggage, the children staring up at Caleb with wide eyes. Sorry. Caleb gathered his bags and moved aside, heading away from the platform toward the dusty main street. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and that scene. The envelope of money remained on his toolbox where Margaret had placed it, and after a few steps, he stuffed it into his pocket without looking at it. Cottonwood Ridge revealed itself slowly as he walked. Main Street ran straight as a rifle shot, lined with the standard establishments of a growing frontier town. A general store, a bank, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a smithy sending up smoke, and the ring of hammer on anvil. Side streets branched off into residential areas, neat houses with front porches and gardens. Everything looked solid, prosperous, permanent, and none of it was his. Caleb passed the Grand Hotel, too expensive, too public, and kept walking. At the far end of town, near where the buildings gave way to prairie, he found a smaller establishment with a weather-worn sign, Murphy's Boarding House, clean rooms, fair rates. The woman who answered his knock was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair and the kind of face that had seen enough to not be easily surprised. She looked him up and down with the practical assessment of someone evaluating a horse. Not cruel, but not particularly warm either. Help you? Her voice carried a hint of Irish, worn smooth by decades in America. I need a room, just for a few nights while I figure out my next move. $1 a night, 2 meals included, rules posted in every room, and I enforce them. She paused. You got money, or you planning to work it off? Caleb pulled out Margaret's envelope and extracted a few bills. I have money. Mrs. Murphy, he assumed that's who she was, took the payment and led him inside without comment on his height, though she did mutter something about door frames that might have been sympathetic or might have just been observation. The house smelled of lye soap and cooking cabbage. She showed him to a small room at the back of the second floor, bare but clean, with a narrow bed that would be too short and a washstand under a small window. Dinner's at 6, breakfast at 7. Miss either and you miss it entirely. She handed him a key. Privy's out back. You cause trouble, you're out on your ear regardless of payment. We clear? Yes, ma'am. She nodded and left, her footsteps creaking down the hallway. Caleb set his bags down and sat carefully on the bed, which groaned under his weight. Through the window he could see the prairie stretching out endlessly, grass moving in waves under the wind. He should eat something. He should make a plan. He should count his remaining money and figure out how long it would last, whether he could afford a ticket back east, or if he'd need to find work here long enough to save up. Instead, he lay back on the too-short bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the boarding house sounds around him, other residents moving about, Mrs. Murphy's voice calling something down the stairs, the distant hammer of the smith continuing his work. For 6 months, Caleb had built a future in his head based on Margaret Sutherland's letters, a house they'd fix up together, a workshop where he could take commissions, maybe children eventually, if she was willing, a place where his size would be an asset rather than an embarrassment, where strong hands and a sturdy back counted for something. All of it gone in the time it took for a woman to look at him and decide he was too much. Dinner at Mrs. Murphy's was a quiet affair. The boarding house held perhaps a dozen residents, mostly single men working various jobs around town, a few older widows, a young married couple waiting for their house to be completed. They ate family style at a long table, passing platters of pork and potatoes and overcooked vegetables. Caleb sat at the end, where there was more room, and ate mechanically. The other boarders shot him occasional glances, but seemed to take their cue from Mrs. Murphy, who treated his presence as utterly unremarkable. The young wife, a pretty blonde who couldn't have been more than 19, stared openly until her husband elbowed her gently. "You're new in town." This from a grizzled man across the table, probably in his 50s, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. "Passing through or staying?" "Undecided," Caleb said. "Fair enough. Name's Porter. I work at the lumber mill. He gestured with his fork at the various men. That's Jim and Robert. They're with the railroad. Harry over there does odd jobs. We're a mixed bunch, but Mrs. Murphy keeps us civil. Caleb Hawthorne. Pleased to meet you. Porter returned to his meal, then added casually, Word travels fast in a town this size. Heard there was some excitement at the train station this afternoon. The table went quiet. Caleb felt every eye on him, curious and assessing. He set down his fork carefully. That would be my business. Sure, just saying, if you need work while you're here, there's usually something available for a man who's not afraid of labor. Porter's tone was neutral, neither sympathetic nor mocking. The mill's always looking for strong backs. Pays decent. I'm a carpenter, Caleb said. Or I was, before the war. Shoulder? Porter nodded at the way Caleb favored his left side. Shiloh. Vicksburg myself. War's got a lot to answer for. Porter pushed back from the table. Anyway, offer stands if you want it. Mill opens at dawn. The conversation shifted to other topics. Someone's broken wagon wheel, complaints about the new bank manager, speculation about whether the railroad would extend another branch line through Cottonwood Ridge. Caleb ate his meal in silence and excused himself as soon as was polite. That night, lying on the too-short bed in the dark, Caleb made plans. He'd stay a week, maybe 2. Work at the mill if they'd have him. Save every penny. His shoulder was better now, not perfect, but functional. He could swing a hammer if he had to, move lumber, do whatever needed doing, save enough for a ticket somewhere else. Somewhere no one knew about Margaret Sutherland or mail-order husbands or the rejection that already felt like it was becoming town legend. Somewhere he could make himself invisible again. Morning came cold and clear. Caleb was at the lumber mill before dawn, finding Porter already there overseeing the first crew. The mill foreman, a barrel-chested German named Klaus, looked Caleb over with the same practical assessment Mrs. Murphy had used. You know lumber. I know wood, carpentry mostly, but I can learn mill work. Strong back? Strong enough. Klaus grunted. We pay by the day. You work a full day, you get full pay. You quit halfway through or can't keep up, you get nothing. Fair? Fair. Good. Porter, show him the basics. We'll see how he does. The work was brutal and simple, hauling logs, operating the saw lines, stacking finished lumber. The mill was loud and dangerous, the kind of place where a moment's inattention could cost fingers or worse. But it was also blessedly impersonal. Nobody cared how tall Caleb was as long as he could lift what needed lifting and follow basic safety rules. By midday, his shoulder was screaming. By evening, his entire body felt like one massive bruise. But he'd earned a day's wage, and Klaus had given him a curt nod that suggested he could come back tomorrow if he wanted. He wanted, because working meant not thinking, because exhaustion was better than the endless loop of Margaret's words playing in his mind, because if he couldn't build a future, at least he could build something to stand on long enough to figure out what came next. The days developed a rhythm. Rise before dawn, work until dark, eat Mrs. Murphy's solid meals, fall into bed too tired to dream. The other mill workers accepted him with the casual camaraderie of men who understood that everyone was running from something or toward something, and it wasn't polite to ask which. On his 4th day in Cottonwood Ridge, Caleb's routine was interrupted. He was hauling a load of planks across the mill yard when he heard a crash and a cry of pain. One of the younger workers, a kid named Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 16, had gotten his hand caught between 2 logs. The boy was screaming, his hand crushed and bleeding, while the other workers stood frozen, unsure what to do. Caleb dropped his load and ran. He reached Tommy in seconds, assessed the situation instantly. The logs had the boy pinned, but they weren't fully secured. If they shifted wrong, they'd crush more than just his hand. Hold still, Caleb ordered, his voice cutting through Tommy's screams. He braced himself, got his hands under the top log, and lifted. His shoulder shrieked protest, old wound pulling in ways that made white spots dance across his vision. But he held steady, muscles straining, creating just enough space for Porter to pull Tommy free. The moment the boy was clear, Caleb let the logs drop and staggered back, breathing hard. Klaus was already barking orders. Someone fetched the doctor, someone else helped get Tommy to the office. The crisis passed as quickly as it had come, leaving Caleb leaning against a support beam, clutching his shoulder. You all right? Porter appeared beside him, concern etched in his weathered face. Fine. Old injury. Just needs a minute. That was quick thinking, and damn strong. Saved that kid from losing more than a hand. Porter studied him thoughtfully. You're wasting yourself here, you know. Mill works fine, but a man with your strength and carpentry skills could do better. Better how? Well, for one thing, Sam Granger's been looking for someone to help with repairs around town. His regular man broke his leg last month, and Sam's getting too old to handle everything himself. It's not steady work exactly, but it's skilled labor. Uses your real trade instead of just your back. Caleb considered this. Why hasn't he hired someone else? Because most folks around here are already employed or don't know a hammer from a crowbar. Porter shrugged. I could introduce you if you're interested. Sam's good people, fair prices, treats workers right. It was tempting. More tempting than it should be, given that Caleb had no intention of staying in Cottonwood Ridge any longer than necessary. But skilled work paid better than mill labor, and better pay meant getting out sooner. All right, he said finally. I'll talk to him. Sam Granger turned out to be a wiry man in his late 60s, with gnarled hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His workshop occupied a small building near the center of town, crammed with tools and half-finished projects. When Porter brought Caleb by that evening after the mill closed, Sam was working on a chair leg, his movements precise despite obvious arthritis. This the fellow you mentioned? Sam looked Caleb up and down without particular judgment. You know carpentry or just claim to? I know it. Learned from my father. Had my own shop before the war. War's where you got that shoulder problem? Caleb nodded. Can you work through it? If I have to. Show me. Sam gestured to a workbench covered with various projects. That cabinet door there's hanging wrong. Fix it. It was a test, clearly. Caleb examined the cabinet door, quickly identified the problem. Loose hinge screws and slight warping in the wood itself. He selected tools from Sam's collection with practiced ease, working methodically to realign the door, shim where necessary, reset the hinges properly. His shoulder protested, but the work was familiar enough that his hands moved almost automatically. When he finished, Sam tested the door himself, opening and closing it several times. He grunted, which might have been approval. Not bad, not perfect, but competent. You remember how to do finish work? Not just rough carpentry? Yes, sir. Porter says you're living at Murphy's. You planning to stay in town, or are you just working until you can afford to leave? The directness of the question caught Caleb off guard. I haven't decided. Fair enough. Here's my offer. I've got more repair work than I can handle. Fences, furniture, building maintenance, custom orders when someone wants something particular. I'll pay you $3 a day to start, and if you prove yourself, we can talk about a more permanent arrangement. I can't promise work every single day, but most days. You interested? $3 a day was significantly better than mill wages, but it also meant staying longer, becoming more visible, more permanent in a town that had already witnessed his humiliation. As if reading his thoughts, Sam added, I don't care about your personal business, Hawthorne. I care whether you can do the work and show up reliable. The rest is your own concern. It was perhaps the most straightforward offer Caleb had received in years. No judgment, no assumptions, just skill for pay. I'm interested, he said. Good. Show up here tomorrow morning at 7. We'll start with Mrs. Patterson's back porch. Stairs are rotting out and she's liable to break her neck on them. And just like that, Caleb Hawthorne found himself with a reason to stay in Cottonwood Ridge a little longer. Over the following weeks, he fell into a new rhythm. Working with Sam was different from the mill, quieter, more precise, requiring thought rather than just endurance. They moved through town tackling various projects, and Caleb learned the geography of Cottonwood Ridge through its broken fences and squeaking doors. People gradually stopped staring quite so openly. He became a familiar sight, the tall carpenter working with old Sam Granger, reliable and quiet and competent. The story of the train station rejection faded from immediate gossip into background town lore, the way such things did when new scandals replaced them. Caleb told himself he was just saving money for wherever came next, that Cottonwood Ridge was temporary, a way station between rejection and whatever future might exist for a man like him. He almost believed it. Until the afternoon he met Eliza Moore, and everything changed again. It was a Tuesday morning in early May when Sam sent Caleb out to the Moore property alone. The job was straightforward enough: repair a garden fence that had partially collapsed during the previous week's windstorm. Sam had sketched a rough map on the back of an old invoice, his arthritic fingers making the lines shaky but readable. "Place is about a mile east of town," Sam explained, squinting at his own drawing. "Small house, neat as a pin. Widow woman lives there by herself. Name's Eliza Moore. Lost her husband maybe 5 years back, keeps mostly to herself, but she's good people. Pays on time, never complains about honest work." Caleb loaded the necessary tools and lumber into Sam's wagon, hitched up the aging mare they used for hauling, and set out under a sky that promised heat later, but was still pleasantly cool. The road leading east was little more than packed dirt with wagon ruts, winding through prairie grass that had started its summer growth. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, prairie roses and black-eyed Susans creating splashes of color against the endless green. The Moore property announced itself gradually. First came a well-maintained vegetable garden, rows of young plants already showing promise. Then a small barn, weather-worn but structurally sound. Finally, the house itself, a modest structure with a covered porch, freshly painted white with green trim. Everything about the place spoke of careful attention, of someone who took pride in what they'd built, even if resources were limited. The damaged fence ran along the eastern side of the property, several posts snapped off at ground level where the wind had caught them wrong. Caleb parked the wagon and was unloading lumber when the front door opened. The woman who emerged moved with an odd sort of carefulness, her left hand held slightly away from her body in a way that suggested chronic discomfort. She wore a simple brown dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, an apron tied at her waist, and her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with a face that might have been unremarkable except for her eyes, gray-green and startlingly direct. "Mr. Granger sent you?" Her voice was lower than he expected, calm and measured. "Yes, ma'am. Caleb Hawthorne. I'm here about your fence." She came down the porch steps and walked toward him, and that's when Caleb noticed the scarring on her left hand and forearm. Old burn marks by the look of them, the kind that left the skin puckered and discolored. The hand itself seemed to work, but stiffly, as if the scarring had limited its flexibility. Eliza Moore followed his gaze to her hand without apparent embarrassment. "House fire," she said simply. 6 years ago. The hand still works mostly, but it doesn't like cold weather, and it's not fond of heavy lifting." "I'm sorry." Caleb heard how inadequate the words were even as he spoke them. "Don't be. I'm alive," which is more than some could say that night. She turned her attention to the fence. The posts snapped clean through. "I tried to shore them up temporarily, but I don't have the strength to reset them properly. Will it be difficult?" "Not particularly. I'll need to dig out the old posts, set new ones, reinforce with cross-bracing. Should take most of the day if the ground cooperates. There's a well pump by the barn. Help yourself to water whenever you need it. If you're here past noon, I'll bring out lunch." She paused, studying him with that same direct gaze. "Sam mentioned you're new in town. Settling in all right?" It was a simple question, asked without particular emphasis, but Caleb heard the genuine curiosity behind it. Not the prurient interest he'd encountered from other townspeople eager for gossip, but actual human concern. "Getting by," he said carefully. Eliza nodded as if this told her everything she needed to know. "Well, I'll leave you to it then. Let me know if you need anything." She returned to the house, and Caleb set to work. The morning was pleasant enough, the physical labor satisfying in the way that straightforward problems always were. Dig out the broken posts, prepare new holes, cut fresh timber to size, set and pack them solid. His shoulder complained but held up, the pain manageable as long as he paced himself. Around midday, as promised, Eliza emerged with a basket. She'd set up a small folding table under a cottonwood tree that shaded one corner of the yard, and proceeded to lay out lunch, thick slices of bread, cheese, cold chicken, pickled vegetables, and a jar of what looked like lemonade. "Wash up first," she said, gesturing toward the pump. "I won't have you eating with hands covered in dirt." There was something pleasantly maternal about the command, though Eliza couldn't have been more than a few years older than Caleb. He washed at the pump, scrubbing his hands thoroughly, and joined her at the table. She'd set 2 places. "You're not eating inside?" He tried to keep surprise from his voice. Why would I? It's a beautiful day, and I spend enough time indoors as it is. She poured lemonade into 2 tin cups. Besides, seems rude to make you eat alone when I'm the one who invited you. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. The food was simple but good, and Caleb realized he was genuinely hungry. Working with Sam meant regular meals, but there was something different about eating real home cooking in the open air, with prairie wind carrying the scent of growing things. Sam tells me you're a skilled carpenter, Eliza said eventually, that you had your own shop before the war. Had been the operative word. Why'd you close it? The question was direct but not invasive, asked the way someone might inquire about the weather. Caleb found himself answering more honestly than he'd intended. Got shot at Shiloh. Shoulder took months to heal, and by the time I could work again, my father's shop had been sold. New owners didn't need another carpenter, especially one who might not be able to keep up. That must have been difficult. It was what it was. Caleb took a drink of lemonade, surprised by how tart and refreshing it tasted. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan. No? Eliza said quietly. It certainly doesn't. Something in her tone made him glance up. She was looking at her scarred hand, turning it slowly in the sunlight as if seeing it for the first time. Then she seemed to shake herself and returned her attention to the meal. The fence looks good so far. You work carefully. I appreciate that. Only way I know how to work. They finished lunch and Eliza packed up the table without fanfare. Before heading back inside, she paused. I have some other small repairs that need addressing. Hinges that stick, a gate that won't close properly, some loose boards on the porch steps. Nothing urgent, but if Sam has time to send you back sometime, I'd appreciate the help. I'm sure we can arrange that, ma'am. Eliza, she corrected. Ma'am makes me feel ancient, and I'm not quite there yet. Eliza, then. The name felt odd in his mouth, too familiar for someone he'd just met. She smiled slightly, the expression transforming her face from merely pleasant to something warmer. Good. I'll see you before you leave. The afternoon passed quickly. Caleb finished the fence work, testing each post to ensure it was solid, adding extra bracing where the wind exposure was worst. It was good work, the kind that would last years if maintained properly. When he finally packed up his tools, the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Eliza came out to inspect the fence, walking along its length with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything. She tested several posts herself, pulling and pushing to check stability. This is excellent work, she said finally. Better than the original, honestly. What do I owe you? Caleb quoted Sam's standard rate, and Eliza counted out payment without hesitation, adding a little extra. When he tried to refuse the additional amount, she shook her head. You worked through lunch, stayed until the job was done right. That deserves fair compensation. She held out the money with her right hand, the left tucked against her side. I wasn't raised to underpay honest work. He took the payment, knowing argument would be pointless. Thank you, and thank you for lunch. It was much appreciated. You're welcome. Tell Sam I'll have that list of other repairs ready when he has time. She paused, then added almost casually, You did good work today, Caleb. Not just competent, good. That's rarer than it should be. The words shouldn't have mattered as much as they did. But as Caleb drove the wagon back toward town, her simple acknowledgement sat warm in his chest, a counterweight to all the other assessments people had made of him over the years. Over the following weeks, Caleb found himself returning to the Moore property regularly. The list of repairs Eliza had mentioned turned out to be extensive, not because things were poorly maintained, but because she simply couldn't do everything herself with one hand that worked properly and one that didn't. Each time she fed him lunch, and each time they talked a little more. He learned that her husband had been a freighter, killed when his wagon overturned during a river crossing. That the fire that scarred her hand had happened 3 months after his death, when a lamp had fallen in the night and she'd burned herself trying to save what little she had left of his belongings. That she supported herself through a combination of vegetable gardening, sewing work she could do despite the hand, and the occasional sale of preserves and baked goods. People think I'm strange for staying out here alone, she told him one afternoon while he was replacing rotted boards on her front porch. She was sitting on the steps, shelling peas into a bowl balanced awkwardly between her knees and her good hand. They think I should move into town, find some sort of position as a seamstress or laundress, something respectable for a widow. Why don't you? Caleb asked, not because he thought she should, but because he was curious about her answer. Because this is my home. Mine and Daniel's, my husband. We built it together, planned for the life we'd have here. Just because he's gone doesn't mean those plans were worthless. She worked another pea pod open with practiced efficiency. And honestly, I like the quiet. In town, everyone's always watching, always judging. Out here, I can just be. Caleb understood that better than he could easily express. People do like to judge. They do. Eliza glanced up at him, her gray-green eyes thoughtful. I heard what happened when you first arrived. At the train station. Caleb's hammer paused mid-swing. He'd been waiting for this, knew the story had to have reached her eventually. Small towns didn't keep secrets long. I'm sure you heard all sorts of versions. I heard that a woman was expecting a husband and rejected him because he was too tall, that she made a scene about it on the platform. Eliza's voice remained neutral, factual. I heard she embarrassed herself more than she embarrassed you, though I doubt it felt that way at the time. It didn't. I imagine not. She finished the last of the peas and set the bowl aside. For what it's worth, Margaret Sutherland's always been more concerned with appearances than substance. Her family has money and status, and she's terrified of anything that might diminish either. You're better off without her. That's easy to say. Doesn't make it less true. Eliza stood, brushing off her skirt. You want to know what I think? I think you traveled halfway across the country in good faith, and she couldn't see past her own vanity long enough to recognize a decent man when he was standing right in front of her. That's her loss, not yours. The fierce certainty in her voice surprised him. Caleb looked down at her, not as far down as he looked at most people, as Eliza was taller than average herself, and saw nothing but honest conviction in her face. You don't even know me, he said quietly. Not really. I know you show up when you say you will. I know your work is careful and precise. I know you don't cut corners even when no one would notice. I know you're gentle with my old mare when you're hitching up the wagon, and you always make sure the chickens haven't gotten into your work area before you start hammering. She met his gaze steadily. That tells me more about who you are than 6 months of letters ever could have told Margaret Sutherland. Something shifted in Caleb's chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was recognition. The sense of finding someone who understood what it meant to be judged for things beyond your control, who'd built a life anyway, despite what the world thought you should be. Thank you, he said, and meant it for more than just the words. Eliza nodded as if the matter was settled. I'm making chicken and dumplings for dinner. You're welcome to stay if you want. God knows I always make too much for one person. It was the first time she'd invited him to stay past working hours, and they both knew it meant something, a line being crossed from professional courtesy to actual friendship. I'd like that, Caleb said. Dinner in Eliza's small kitchen was a revelation, not because the food was particularly fancy, it was plain country cooking, simple and hearty, but because of how natural it felt. They ate at a small table near the window, watching the prairie sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Conversation flowed easily, covering everything and nothing, childhood memories, books they'd read, opinions on the best way to preserve tomatoes. I miss cooking for someone, Eliza admitted, ladling out seconds. When Daniel was alive, I'd spend half the day planning meals, trying new recipes. Now it seems pointless to make anything elaborate just for myself. This is better than anything I've eaten since... Caleb paused, realizing he'd been about to say, since my mother died, and not entirely comfortable with the emotion that accompanied the thought. In a long time. You're welcome here any time. Eliza said it simply, as if offering ongoing friendship was the most natural thing in the world. I mean that, even if there's no work to be done. Company is harder to come by than fence repairs. After that evening, Caleb's visits to the Moore property took on a different character. Yes, there was always work. A property that size required constant maintenance, but the work became secondary to the companionship. He'd arrive early, they'd share breakfast on the porch, they'd work through the morning, her tending her garden while he tackled whatever repair was needed. Lunch together. More work. Sometimes dinner. Conversation threading through it all like water through a creek bed, natural and essential. He learned to anticipate the things her damaged hand made difficult and address them without drawing attention to the accommodation. When he built her a new gate, he made the latch easy to operate one-handed. When he repaired her chicken coop, he ensured all the latches could be managed without two fully functional hands. He never mentioned these modifications and she never acknowledged them directly, but he caught her small smile of recognition each time. In return, she taught him things his mother had never gotten around to. How to tell when bread dough had risen enough, the proper way to fold sheets so they didn't wrinkle, which wildflowers made decent tea and which would make you sick. Practical knowledge shared in the same spirit as his carpentry lessons, an exchange of competencies between two people who'd learned to be self-sufficient but hadn't forgotten the value of community. "You're good at this," she told him one afternoon. They were sitting on her porch, shelling beans together. She'd shown him the technique, patient with his larger fingers fumbling the delicate work. At shelling beans? At being present. A lot of people, they're always looking past where they are, planning for the next thing, chasing after something they think they're missing. You just are. It's restful. Caleb considered this. Might just be that I don't have anywhere else to be chasing after. Or maybe you've learned something most people never figure out. Eliza's hands moved steadily, her damaged left hand cradling the bowl while her right did the fine work. That being here, being now, is enough. Is it? The question came out more vulnerable than he intended. Enough? She looked at him directly, and in the afternoon light her eyes were more green than gray, steady and clear. Some days yes, some days no, but that's true whether you're chasing dreams or sitting still. At least sitting still, you can see what you actually have instead of what you think you're missing. It was the kind of conversation they'd started having more frequently. Philosophical, honest, touching on wounds neither of them had fully healed from. Caleb found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. The way his size had always made him feel like an apology walking on two legs. The constant mental calculation of doorways and chairs and whether he'd fit without causing disruption. The bone-deep weariness of always being noticed, never invisible. Eliza listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her hands never stopping their steady work. "I used to feel that way about my hand," she said when he'd finished, "after the fire. Like I was walking around with this visible proof of damage, and everyone who saw it was making judgments about what I could or couldn't do, whether I was still whole enough to be worth their time. Do you still feel that way?" "Sometimes. Usually when I'm in town and someone stares too long, or when I can't do something I used to manage easily." She held up the scarred hand, examining it dispassionately. "But mostly I've made peace with it. This is my hand. It works differently than it used to, but it still works. Anyone who can't see past the scars to the person holding the hand isn't someone I need in my life anyway." "That's a good philosophy." "It's a necessary one." She returned to the beans. "The alternative is spending your whole life apologizing for existing, and that seems like a waste of perfectly good existence." Summer deepened into July, bringing heat that made afternoon work impossible. Caleb adjusted his schedule, arriving at the Moore property in the early morning when the air was still cool, working until the heat became oppressive, then retreating to the shade of Eliza's porch to wait out the worst of it. Sometimes he'd nap in an old rocking chair while she worked on her sewing inside. Sometimes they'd talk, voices lazy in the thick air. Sometimes they'd simply sit in companionable silence, watching the prairie shimmer under the relentless sun. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Sam Granger found them. The old carpenter arrived in his wagon looking troubled, his weathered face set in lines that suggested bad news. "Caleb, Mrs. Moore," he nodded to each of them. "Sorry to interrupt, but I need to borrow my assistant here." "Is something wrong?" Eliza asked, setting aside her sewing. "Nothing that concerns you directly, ma'am, but yes, there's been trouble in town." Sam's gaze shifted to Caleb. "That woman, Miss Sutherland, she's getting married. Tomorrow. Big affair, apparently. Half the town's in an uproar helping with preparations." Caleb felt his chest tighten. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she's spreading talk. Nothing direct, you understand, but implications. Questions about what kind of man travels halfway across the country to marry a woman without being honest about himself. Whether such a man might be dangerous or deceptive in other ways. It's subtle, but it's poisoning the well. Let her talk. Caleb's voice came out harder than he intended. I've done nothing wrong. I know that, and anyone with sense knows that. But not everyone has sense, and a woman like Margaret Sutherland has influence in certain circles. Sam rubbed his jaw. Look, I'm not saying you need to defend yourself. I'm saying you should be aware that the climate in town might get uncomfortable for a while. Some folks might be less friendly, ask more questions. Eliza stood abruptly. That's ridiculous. She's the one who should be ashamed, treating someone that way and then trying to paint herself as the victim. I agree, ma'am, but that's how these things work sometimes. The person with money and status gets to control the narrative. Sam turned back to Caleb, I wanted you to hear it from me rather than walking into it blind. I appreciate that. There's one more thing. Sam hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Some of the bigger property owners, the ones in Margaret's social circle, they're suggesting maybe they'd prefer to use other carpenters for their work. Nothing official, just preferences being expressed. The implications settled over Caleb like a cold blanket despite the heat. He was being frozen out, his livelihood threatened, because a woman couldn't admit she'd acted poorly. How much will this affect business? He asked quietly. Hard to say. We don't do much work for that crowd anyway. They usually bring in specialists from larger towns for anything fancy. But it won't help. Sam sighed. I'm not letting you go, if that's what you're worried about. You're good at what you do, and I won't have anyone telling me who I can or can't employ, but I wanted you prepared. After Sam left, Caleb sat heavily in the rocking chair, staring out at the prairie without really seeing it. Eliza moved closer, perching on the porch railing where she could see his face. This isn't fair, she said quietly. Fair doesn't have much to do with anything. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you should accept it lying down. What exactly am I supposed to do? Caleb heard the bitterness in his own voice. Storm into her wedding and defend my honor? Write letters to the newspaper? The woman decided I'm not worth her time. Now she's decided I'm not worth anyone's time. I can't fight that. You can fight it by staying, by continuing to do good work, by proving through your actions that her assessment was wrong. Eliza's voice was fierce. You can fight it by not letting her drive you away. Maybe leaving would be easier. Easier isn't the same as better. She slid down from the railing, came to stand directly in front of him. You've built something here, Caleb. You have work. You have Sam's respect. You have... She paused, seemed to reconsider her words. You have a place. Don't let someone else's narrow-mindedness take that away from you. I'm tired, Eliza. The admission cost him something. I'm tired of being the problem in every room I enter. Tired of watching people make decisions about who I am based on something I can't control. I thought coming here might be different, but it's the same story wearing a different dress. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her damaged hand resting against her skirt. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less certain. It is different here. Or it could be. You have at least one person who sees you for who you actually are. Maybe that doesn't feel like much right now, but it's something. She met his eyes. It's something to me anyway. The weight behind those words hung in the air between them, meaning layered beneath meaning. Caleb looked at her, truly looked, and saw someone who'd been rejected by the world in her own way, who'd chosen to stay anyway, to build a life on her own terms. Someone who understood. Thank you, he said finally, for saying that. I'm not just saying it. Eliza returned to her sewing, picking up the fabric with familiar efficiency. Now, you going to sit there brooding all afternoon, or are you going to help me figure out how to adjust this dress pattern? Mrs. Chen ordered it, but she's shorter than the standard sizing, and I can't quite work out the modifications with one hand. It was such a deliberate change of subject, such a clear invitation back to normalcy, that Caleb found himself almost smiling despite everything. He joined her at the small work table, and together they puzzled through the adjustments, his larger hands following her precise instructions, two people working together toward a common goal. And if his hands sometimes brushed hers in the process, If he was more aware than ever of her presence beside him, of the way afternoon light caught in her dark hair and the quiet competence in her movements, well, that was something to think about another day. For now, it was enough to sit together in the heat and the quiet, building something small but real against a world that seemed determined to tear things down. The changes came gradually at first, subtle enough that Caleb might have dismissed them as coincidence if Sam hadn't warned him. A hardware store clerk who'd always been friendly suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. The baker's wife, who usually exchanged pleasantries, fell silent when he entered the shop. Mrs. Murphy's other boarders grew quieter at dinner, conversations dying awkwardly when he joined the table. Margaret Sutherland's wedding had been, by all accounts, a spectacular affair. The details filtered through town like pollen on the wind. The elaborate dress ordered from St. Louis, the three-tiered cake, the reception that lasted until midnight with dancing and champagne. Her new husband was a banker's son from Kansas City, appropriately tall but not excessively so, well-mannered, properly dull. Everything Margaret had apparently wanted. And with her happiness secured, she'd begun the careful work of rewriting history. Not through outright lies, Margaret was too clever for that, but through strategic sighs and meaningful pauses. Questions posed to her friends about what kind of man would deceive a woman about something so fundamental. Concerns expressed about whether someone capable of such deception might be capable of other dishonesty. Nothing actionable, nothing Caleb could directly confront, just poison dripped slowly into the town's water supply. "She's protecting herself," Eliza said when Caleb told her about the growing coldness. They were in her garden, Caleb building raised beds for her fall planting while she worked nearby, pulling weeds with her good hand. "If she admits she rejected you for something shallow and cruel, she looks bad. But if she can make it seem like you were somehow dishonest or inappropriate, then her rejection becomes justified. It's working. With some people, yes, but not everyone." Eliza sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Mrs. Patterson told me yesterday that you did beautiful work on her porch stairs. Said she felt safer going in and out of her house than she has in years. That's worth more than Margaret Sutherland's opinion. Mrs. Patterson is 80 years old and half blind. She's not exactly representative. She's a human being who you helped. That counts." Eliza's voice sharpened slightly. "You're so determined to believe the worst about yourself that you can't see what's actually happening. Yes, some people are listening to Margaret's nonsense, but plenty of others see through it. Sam's still employing you. I'm still—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider. "You still have friends here." Friends. The word sat strangely in Caleb's mind. He'd had acquaintances, work associates, people who tolerated his presence for what he could do for them. But friends? People who valued him for himself rather than his usefulness, those had been rare even before the war, nearly non-existent after. Except maybe Eliza. Whatever was growing between them had moved past simple friendship into territory Caleb didn't quite know how to navigate. He thought about her more than was probably appropriate. Found himself saving up observations and stories to share with her. Noticed details, the way she tucked loose hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her laugh was slightly different when she was genuinely amused versus just being polite, the particular shade of green her eyes became in certain light. He was falling for her. Had probably been falling for weeks without quite admitting it to himself. And that terrified him almost as much as the growing hostility in town, because what did he have to offer someone like Eliza? A man with no permanent home, no prospects beyond day labor, a walking target for gossip and judgment. "You're thinking too loud," Eliza said, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. "I can practically hear the gears grinding from here." "Sorry." "Don't apologize, just tell me what's bothering you, besides the obvious." Caleb hammered another nail into the bed frame, buying time. "Do you ever think about leaving, packing up and starting over somewhere no one knows your history?" "Sometimes. Usually on the hard days when my hand aches and the loneliness feels heavier than usual." She pulled another weed, examined its roots before tossing it aside. "But then I remember that every place has hard days. Every place has people who'll judge you for something. At least here I have land that's mine, work I've built, memories of when things were good." "That's different. You have roots here. I'm just passing through." "Are you?" Eliza looked at him directly, her expression unreadable. "Because from where I'm sitting, It looks like you've been putting down roots whether you meant to or not. You have steady work. You've learned the town. You've built relationships. That's not passing through, Caleb. That's settling. Settling implies people want you to stay. I want you to stay. The words came out quietly but firmly, without hesitation or equivocation. There. I've said it. You can do with that information whatever you like. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Eliza kneeling in the garden dirt, Caleb frozen with hammer in hand, the summer heat pressing down like a physical weight. Around them, insects buzzed and prairie wind rustled through growing things, but all Caleb could hear was his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Eliza, you don't have to say anything right now. She returned to her weeding, movements perhaps a bit more deliberate than necessary. I'm just tired of dancing around the truth. We're friends, good friends, and maybe it could be more than that if you weren't so convinced you're not worth caring about. It's not that simple. It never is, but that doesn't make it less true. She sat back, met his gaze again. I'm not Margaret Sutherland, Caleb. I don't care how tall you are or what people might say about us. I care that you're kind and competent and you make me laugh. I care that I look forward to your visits more than anything else in my week. I care that when I'm with you, I don't feel broken or less than, or like I need to apologize for taking up space in the world. The vulnerability in her voice nearly broke him. Caleb set down his hammer carefully and crossed to where she knelt, crouching beside her so they were eye level. You're not broken, he said quietly. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Then maybe you should consider that I might have decent judgment about people, including you. She reached out with her good hand, touched his arm briefly. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just saying you don't have to face everything alone. Not anymore. Before Caleb could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted. They both stood, turning to see 3 riders coming up the road toward Eliza's property. Caleb recognized them, property owners from town, members of the social circle that revolved around families like the Sutherlands. Men who'd never given him the time of day before and certainly hadn't sought out his company. The lead rider was Thomas Blackwood, who owned the largest dry goods store in Cottonwood Ridge. He was perhaps 50, well-fed and prosperous, with the kind of confidence that came from never having had to question his place in the world. His companions were similarly comfortable-looking men, all dressed too well for a casual afternoon ride. Mrs. Moore. Blackwood touched his hat brim in Eliza's direction, his tone polite but cool. Didn't mean to disturb you. We were just passing by and thought we'd check on the property. Make sure everything's secure out here. It was a transparent excuse. Eliza's property was a mile from the main road, not on the way to anywhere. They'd come specifically to see something, and Caleb had a sinking feeling he knew what that something was. Everything's fine, Mr. Blackwood. As you can see, I'm just doing some garden work. Eliza's voice remained steady, but Caleb saw her left hand curl protectively against her side. Was there something specific you needed? Just being neighborly. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Caleb, assessment cold and measuring. That's Hawthorne, isn't it? The fellow who's been doing repair work around town. Caleb Hawthorne, yes. Caleb straightened to his full height, refusing to hunch or minimize himself. I'm building Mrs. Moore some garden beds. I see. Tell me, Hawthorne, how long have you been working out here? Seems like you're at the Moore property quite frequently. The implications hung heavy in the summer air. Caleb felt anger rise hot in his chest, but kept his voice level. I do whatever repair work Mrs. Moore needs. Sam Granger sends me when there are jobs to be done. And I'm sure the work is entirely necessary. Blackwood's tone suggested he believed nothing of the sort. Still, people talk. A widow woman living alone, a single man spending considerable time here. You understand how it might appear. I understand that people with too much time on their hands invent scandals where none exist. Eliza's voice cut sharp as a knife. Mr. Hawthorne is a skilled carpenter doing honest work. If people choose to see something inappropriate in that, perhaps they should examine their own minds rather than my property. Now, Mrs. Moore, no one's suggesting, yes, you are. Eliza moved to stand beside Caleb, her posture defiant despite her smaller size. You're suggesting that there's something improper about a woman hiring help she needs and a man providing that help professionally. You're suggesting that I should be ashamed of needing assistance, or that Mr. Hawthorne should be ashamed of offering it. Well, I'm not ashamed, and neither should he be. One of Blackwood's companions shifted in his saddle uncomfortably. We're just concerned for your reputation, ma'am. A woman in your position needs to be careful about appearances. My reputation is my own concern, not yours. And frankly, if my reputation rests on whether or not I hire a carpenter to fix my fence, then perhaps it wasn't worth much to begin with. Eliza's cheeks had flushed pink, but her voice remained controlled. Now, if you gentlemen are finished checking on my security, I have work to return to. Blackwood's jaw tightened. This is friendly advice, Mrs. Moore. You'd be wise to consider it. Certain associations can damage one's standing in the community, make it difficult to conduct business, maintain relationships. Surely you see that. What I see is 3 men who've ridden out of their way to deliver threats wrapped in concern. Eliza crossed her arms. I appreciate your time, but as I said, I have work to do. The men exchanged glances, clearly having expected a different response. Blackwood gathered his reins, his expression hardening. Your choice, ma'am. Just remember that choices have consequences. They rode off, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Caleb and Eliza stood watching until they disappeared over a rise in the prairie, neither speaking until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Well, Eliza said finally, that was about as subtle as a brick through a window. I should stop coming here. The words tasted like ashes. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, causing problems for people who don't deserve them. Don't you dare! Eliza turned on him, eyes blazing. Don't you dare let those pompous jackasses dictate your choices. This is my property, my decision, and I'll hire whoever I damn well please to work on it. Eliza, they'll make your life difficult. You heard Blackwood. They can affect your business, your relationships in town. Let them try. I sell vegetables and do sewing work. The people who buy from me aren't the Thomas Blackwoods of the world. They're farmers' wives and working families who care more about quality and price than social standing. She was breathing hard now, anger and determination mixing in her voice. I won't be bullied, not by them, and not by your misguided attempt to protect me by disappearing. I'm trying to do the right thing. The right thing is standing your ground. The right thing is not letting small-minded people drive you away from a place where you've started to build something real. She grabbed his arm with her good hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I meant what I said earlier. I want you to stay. Not just for the repair work, not just because you're useful, but because I care about you. And if that makes things complicated or difficult or scandalous, then so be it. I'd rather have complicated with you than safe and lonely without you. The raw honesty in her words stripped away Caleb's careful defenses. He looked down at her, this woman who'd somehow seen past all the barriers he'd built, who'd decided he was worth fighting for even when he couldn't quite believe it himself, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. I care about you too, he said quietly. More than I probably should. More than is smart, given everything. Since when is caring about someone supposed to be smart? Eliza's anger softened into something gentler, but no less intense. Feelings don't operate on logic, Caleb. They just are. And what are we supposed to do with these feelings? Pretend the whole town isn't watching and judging? We're supposed to be honest about them. To each other, if not to anyone else. She hesitated, then added, and maybe we stop pretending this is just friendship when it's clearly become something more. The prairie wind picked up, carrying the scent of growing things and distant rain. Storm clouds were building on the western horizon, dark and heavy with promise. Caleb became aware that they were still standing very close, that Eliza's hand remained on his arm, that the space between them felt charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be with someone when the world seems determined to make it difficult. Neither do I. But maybe we figure it out together. Eliza smiled slightly, the expression transforming her face. One day at a time, one problem at a time, just like everything else worth doing. Before Caleb could respond, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. They both looked west, where the storm clouds had grown more ominous, their edges lit by lightning that forked between sky and earth. That's coming in fast, Eliza said. You should probably head back to town before it hits. But Caleb was studying the clouds with growing concern. He'd seen storms like this before. The particular color of the sky, the way the wind had shifted direction, the oppressive heaviness in the air. That's not just a regular storm. That's serious weather. Even as he spoke, the wind picked up dramatically, bending the prairie grass nearly flat. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Another crack of thunder, closer now, and the clouds seemed to boil across the sky with unnatural speed. "We need to get inside," Caleb said urgently. "Now!" They barely made it to the house before the storm hit in full fury. Rain came down in sheets so thick visibility dropped to almost nothing. Wind howled around the small structure, making the windows rattle and the whole building creak. Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder instantaneous and deafening. Eliza moved through the house quickly, closing shutters and securing anything loose. Caleb helped where he could, hyper-aware of every crash of thunder, every gust of wind that made the walls shudder. He'd been in storms before, but something about this one felt different, more violent, more personal somehow. "The barn," Eliza said suddenly, her face going pale. "I didn't close the barn doors. If they blow open, the wind could tear the whole structure apart. I've got 3 months of hay stored in there, and all my tools—" "Stay here, I'll check it." Caleb was already moving toward the door. "Are you insane? You can't go out in this?" "The barn's what, 50 yards? I'll be fine." He grabbed an oilskin coat from the peg by the door. "Just stay inside where it's safe." Caleb, but he was already out the door, pushing against wind that tried to force him back. The rain hit like bullets, cold and sharp. He could barely see the barn through the deluge, just a dark shape against the darker storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating everything in stark white blue. And in that instant he saw that Eliza was right. The barn doors were swinging wildly, slamming open and shut with violent force. He ran, or tried to, fighting wind that seemed determined to push him off course. His boots slipped in mud that was forming faster than the ground could absorb water. Another lightning strike, close enough that he felt the hair on his arms stand up, smelled ozone sharp and electric. The barn doors were heavy, built to withstand normal weather, but not this kind of sustained assault. One of them had already partially torn from its upper hinge, hanging at a crazy angle. Caleb grabbed it, using his weight and strength to force it closed against the wind. The door fought him like a living thing, but he managed to get it into position and throw the heavy crossbar that would hold it secure. He was reaching for the second door when he heard the crack. Not thunder this time, but wood giving way under stress. He looked up just in time to see part of the barn's roof lifting, boards tearing free in the wind. Debris started falling, and Caleb dove for cover, pressing himself against the barn wall as pieces of wood and roofing material crashed down around him. Something heavy struck his shoulder, his bad shoulder, and pain exploded white-hot through his upper body. He heard himself cry out, the sound lost in the storm's fury. Through the agony, he forced himself to keep moving, to secure that second door before more damage could be done. His right arm was still functional. That would have to be enough. It took everything he had to get that second door closed and barred. By the time he finished, he was shaking from pain and exertion, his clothes soaked through, his shoulders screaming protest with every movement. The smart thing would be to get back to the house immediately. Instead, he made himself check the barn interior. Water was coming through the damaged section of roof, but the hay bales were protected by their placement and by a tarp Eliza had wisely secured over them. Her tools were dry. The structural damage, while serious, wasn't immediately catastrophic. The building would hold, at least until the storm passed. Satisfied, Caleb made his way back outside. The rain hadn't lessened any, and the wind seemed, if anything, to have increased. He was halfway to the house when his foot caught on something, a rock, a rut, something, and he went down hard. The impact jarred his shoulder viciously, and for a moment the world went gray at the edges, pain overwhelming everything else. He lay there in the mud and rain, breathing hard, trying to gather strength to stand. This was absurd. He'd survived being shot at Shiloh, survived the long recovery, survived rejection and hardship and everything else life had thrown at him. He wasn't about to be defeated by a summer storm in some damaged barn roof. "Caleb!" Eliza's voice cut through the rain, raw with panic. "Where are you?" He tried to answer but only managed to groan. Then she was there, kneeling beside him in the mud, her hands on his face, his shoulders, checking for damage. "You idiot," she said, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. You absolute idiot. I told you not to go out there. Barn secure, he managed. Doors closed. Hay's safe. I don't care about the damn hay. Can you stand? With Eliza's help, he made it to his feet, though every movement sent fresh pain through his shoulder. She got under his good arm, taking as much of his weight as she could, and together they staggered toward the house. The distance seemed infinite, each step an exercise in endurance. But finally they were through the door, and Eliza was kicking it closed behind them. She got him to a chair and immediately started examining his shoulder, her hands gentle but thorough despite her own damaged left hand. Caleb hissed when she touched the worst of it. It's swelling already. Could be dislocated, could just be badly bruised. Either way, you need a doctor. She was already moving, gathering supplies. And you need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. I'll be fine. You will be, because I'm going to make sure of it. She returned with towels and a blanket. Now stop being stubborn and let me help you. There was something in her voice, fear underlying the anger, concern deeper than the situation perhaps warranted. Caleb let her help him out of the soaked coat and shirt, watching her face as she worked. Her jaw was set, her movements efficient but not quite steady. Eliza, he said quietly, I'm all right, really. You're not all right. You're hurt because you went out in a dangerous storm to save my property. Her voice cracked slightly. You could have been killed, Caleb. That roof section that came down, if it had hit you wrong. But it didn't. But it could have? She stopped, pressed her good hand against her eyes. I can't lose someone else I care about. I can't watch another person She stopped, swallowed hard. You matter to me. Don't you understand that? You matter. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small kitchen, everything had gone very quiet. Caleb reached out with his good arm, touched Eliza's hand gently. She looked up at him, her gray-green eyes wet with tears she was trying not to shed. You matter to me too, he said. That's why I went out there. Not just to save the barn, but because it was yours. Because everything you have is in this property, and I couldn't stand by and let it be damaged if there was something I could do to prevent it. That's exactly the problem. But she was crying now, proper tears that she didn't try to hide. You're always putting yourself last. Always sacrificing for everyone else. When do you get to matter? When does someone protect you? Everyone needs protecting sometimes. Everyone needs someone who will fight for them, who will value them enough to be careful with them. She moved closer, and Caleb found himself looking into eyes that held more emotion than he knew what to do with. Let me be that person for you, please. Stop trying to bear everything alone. Outside, thunder crashed and rain hammered against the roof. Inside, something fundamental shifted between them, a wall coming down that neither had quite realized they'd been maintaining. Caleb pulled Eliza closer with his good arm, and she came willingly, carefully avoiding his injured shoulder as she leaned against him. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the storm gradually exhaust itself, holding on to each other like anchors in uncertain seas. And when Eliza finally pulled back enough to look at his face, when she reached up with her scarred hand to touch his cheek, with a gentleness that made his chest ache, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that he'd found something worth staying for, something worth fighting for, no matter what the Thomas Blackwoods of the world had to say about it. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the prairie washed clean and sparkling under fresh sunlight. Caleb woke to find himself on Eliza's settee, covered with quilts, his shoulder throbbing but manageable. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drew him fully awake, and he sat up carefully to find Eliza at the stove, still in yesterday's dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. You should have woken me, he said, his voice rough with sleep. I could have slept in the barn once the rain stopped. With a damaged shoulder and soaked through? Absolutely not. She brought him coffee without asking if he wanted it. Doc Harrison's coming by this morning. I sent word with the Cooper boy at first light. That wasn't necessary. It was entirely necessary, and you're going to sit there and let him examine you without complaint. Her tone brooked no argument. I spent half the night listening to you groan in your sleep. That shoulder needs proper attention. But Caleb wanted to protest further, but found he didn't have the energy. The truth was, his shoulder felt worse this morning than it had the night before. A deep ache that radiated down his arm and up into his neck. He sipped the coffee gratefully and watched Eliza move around her kitchen with familiar efficiency, her damaged hand and the long night showing no effect on her capable movements. "You didn't sleep," he observed. "Neither did you, really. I heard you moving around." She set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "Eat. You'll need your strength for when Sam finds out what happened. He's going to have opinions." She was right about that. Doc Harrison arrived around 9, a stern-faced man in his 60s who'd apparently seen every possible injury the frontier could produce. He examined Caleb's shoulder with practiced hands, poking and prodding while asking questions about range of motion and pain levels. "Not dislocated, which is good news," the doctor announced finally. "Severe bruising and some strained ligaments. Could have been much worse if that debris had hit you more directly." He looked at Eliza. "Keep it bound for at least a week. Ice if you can get it, heat after 3 days. No heavy lifting, no overhead work. He pushes it too hard, he'll do permanent damage to what's already a compromised joint." "I'll make sure he follows orders," Eliza said firmly. "I can make my own decisions," Caleb protested. "Not about this, you can't." Doc Harrison was already packing his bag. "You want to be able to use that arm when you're 50, you'll listen. Carpenter who can't lift or swing a hammer isn't much good to anyone, including himself." After the doctor left, Caleb tried to stand, to gather his things, to return to some semblance of normalcy. Eliza stopped him with a hand on his good shoulder. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" "Back to town, back to Murphy's. I've imposed enough." "You haven't imposed at all. And with that shoulder, you're not fit to work for at least a few days. You might as well stay here where someone can keep an eye on you." "Eliza, after yesterday, after Blackwood and his friends, staying here would just make everything worse. Or it would make everything clear." She sat down across from him, her expression serious but not unkind. "We've been dancing around this for weeks now. What we are to each other, what we might become. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and just be honest about it." "Honest about what exactly? That I'm falling for a woman I have no business being involved with? That every moment I spend here puts your reputation at risk? That I'm—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "That you're what?" Eliza prompted gently. "That I'm terrified," he admitted, the words coming out raw and unguarded. "Terrified that I'll hurt you somehow just by being near you. Terrified that the town will make your life miserable because you chose to care about someone like me. Terrified that I'll wake up one day and you'll realize Margaret Sutherland was right, that I'm too much, too big, too—" "Stop." Eliza's voice was quiet but absolute. "Just stop. I'm not Margaret Sutherland. I'm not interested in what society thinks I should want or who I should care about. I'm interested in you, the actual person sitting in front of me, not some distorted reflection in other people's judgment." "But no buts. Listen to me, Caleb Hawthorne. I am a grown woman who survived a husband's death, a house fire, and 5 years of building a life entirely on my own terms. I am more than capable of making my own decisions about who I spend my time with and why." She reached across the table, took his hand with her scarred one. "And I choose you, flaws, fears, excessive height, and all." The simple declaration nearly undid him. Caleb looked at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers smaller and marked by old trauma, but no less strong, and felt something fundamental settle in his chest. "I choose you too," he said quietly. "I just don't want you to regret it. The only thing I'd regret is letting fear make my choices for me." She squeezed his hand gently. "Now, are you going to stay here and rest like the doctor ordered, or are you going to be stubborn about it?" He stayed. That first day set a pattern for the week that followed. Caleb remained at the Moore property, sleeping on the settee despite Eliza's offers of her actual bed, helping with light tasks that didn't strain his shoulder, gradually healing under her watchful care. They talked more openly than before, walls down, guards lowered. She told him about her marriage to Daniel, the love they'd shared and the plans that had died with him. He told her about his parents, the shop that had been his inheritance and his identity, the war that had broken more than just his body. "Do you miss it?" she asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose. "The carpentry shop, the life you had before?" "Sometimes. Mostly I miss the feeling of having a place, of knowing where I belonged and what I was supposed to be doing." He flexed his bad shoulder carefully, testing the range of motion that was slowly returning. But that place doesn't exist anymore. The shop's gone. My parents are gone. The version of myself that lived that life is gone. Can't miss something that isn't real anymore. You could build a new shop, start over. With what capital? What reputation? He shook his head. Besides, who's going to hire a carpenter in a town where half the respectable citizens think he's some kind of disreputable character? The half that matters will hire you. The half that understands quality work and decent character. Eliza was quiet for a moment, then added, Sam's not getting any younger. Have you thought about what happens when he retires? That's years away. Maybe, maybe not. He's pushing 70. His hands are getting worse. Eventually he'll need to pass the business to someone. She looked at him meaningfully. Someone he trusts. Someone who knows the work and the town. The implication was clear, but Caleb couldn't quite let himself believe it. Taking over Sam's business would mean permanent roots in Cottonwood Ridge, a future built on the foundation of skills and relationships rather than escape plans and temporary arrangements. It would mean claiming a place rather than just occupying it. It would mean staying. By the end of the week, his shoulder had improved enough that Doc Harrison cleared him for light work. Caleb returned to town and to Sam's shop, expecting questions or perhaps disapproval for his extended absence. Instead, Sam simply nodded when Caleb explained where he'd been and why. Eliza's good people, the old carpenter said, running his gnarled fingers over a piece of maple he was preparing for a table leg. Always has been. Town could use more folks with her kind of spine. He glanced up at Caleb. Speaking of which, you hear about the Brennan building? No, what about it? Caught fire 3 nights back, big one. Started in the dry goods storage and spread fast. Volunteer brigade got it mostly under control, but there's significant damage. Thomas Blackwood's been organizing the rebuilding effort, calling in contractors from as far as Kansas City. Sam's expression was unreadable. Seems to be quite the undertaking. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because there's going to be a town meeting tonight about it. Everyone's invited, especially anyone with construction experience. They'll be discussing the rebuild, assigning work crews, that sort of thing. Sam set down his work, met Caleb's eyes directly. You should be there. Sam, you know how certain people feel about me. My showing up would just cause problems. Or it would show you're not running scared, that you're a part of this community, whether they like it or not. The old man's voice was firm. Look, I've been in this town 40 years. I've seen plenty of folks come and go, seen reputations rise and fall. You know what matters in the long run? What you do when things get hard. You can hide, or you can show up and prove who you actually are. Your choice. The town hall was packed that evening, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Caleb arrived late, slipping in at the back and trying to be inconspicuous, a futile effort given his height. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd, but he kept his eyes forward and found a spot against the far wall. Thomas Blackwood stood at the front, gesturing to architectural drawings spread across a table. He was in full form, all civic leadership and controlled authority, explaining the scope of the damage and the proposed reconstruction. The Brennan building had been one of the largest structures on Main Street, housing not just Blackwood's dry goods store, but also a small restaurant, a dressmaker's shop, and several storage spaces. Rebuilding it properly would be a major undertaking. We'll need multiple crews working simultaneously, Blackwood was saying. Foundation work, framing, roofing, finish carpentry. I've already contracted with Morrison Construction out of Kansas City for the primary work, but we'll need local labor to support them. Anyone with relevant experience who's willing to help, please see me after the meeting. A hand went up in the crowd. Mrs. Patterson, of all people, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age. Seems to me we have plenty of local expertise without bringing in outsiders. Sam Granger's been building things in this town since before some of you were born. Of course we value Sam's contributions, Blackwood said smoothly, but a project this size requires a larger operation than one elderly carpenter and his assistant can provide. His assistant's right there, Mrs. Patterson pointed directly at Caleb, causing every head to swivel in his direction. That young man rebuilt my porch stairs so well they'll probably outlast the house. Seems foolish not to use him. Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your confidence, but we need to consider Consider what? That he's too tall? That some busybody spread gossip about him? The old woman's voice dripped with disdain. I've lived in this town long enough to know the difference between reputation and character. That boy has character, more than I can say for some. A murmur ran through the crowd, some supportive, some uncomfortable. Caleb felt his face burning but kept his expression neutral. Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly. This isn't about personal disputes, Mrs. Patterson. This is about ensuring the rebuild is done properly and efficiently. Then you'd be a fool not to use every skilled hand available. This from Porter, the mill worker who'd first befriended Caleb. I've seen Hawthorne work. He's careful, precise, and strong as an ox. You need someone who can do heavy lifting and detail work both? He's your man. More voices joined in, a surprising chorus of support. The farmer whose fence Caleb had repaired. The widow whose shed door he'd rehung. Even one of Mrs. Murphy's other boarders speaking up about Caleb's reliability and work ethic. It wasn't everyone. Plenty of people remained silent, and Caleb could feel the disapproval radiating from certain quarters. But it was enough to shift the energy in the room. Blackwood held up his hands for quiet. I hear your testimonials. However, the decision about contracting ultimately rests with the building owners, and the door at the back of the hall burst open with a bang that cut through every conversation. A young boy stood there, breathless and wild-eyed, recognizable as one of the Simpson kids who lived above the hardware store on Main Street. Fire! He gasped. There's a fire at the schoolhouse. It's spreading fast. The room erupted. People surged toward the door, voices rising in panic and confusion. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, surrounded by other buildings, the church, several residences, the small library. If the fire spread, Caleb didn't think. He simply moved, his long legs carrying him out of the hall and down Main Street faster than most of the crowd. Behind him, he could hear Blackwood trying to organize people into bucket brigades, someone else yelling about horses and wagons. But Caleb's focus had narrowed to a single point, the column of smoke rising into the twilight sky. He reached the schoolhouse to find flames already consuming one entire side of the building, orange and red against the darkening evening. A small crowd had gathered, mostly parents frantic about whether any children had been inside. The volunteer fire brigade was arriving, men hauling equipment and trying to establish water lines from the nearest well. Everyone's out, the schoolteacher, Miss Allen, was shouting. I was locking up when I smelled smoke. Everyone's out. But even as she spoke, a woman pushed forward screaming, Where's Sarah? Where's my daughter? She stayed after to help clean the slates. Miss Allen's face went white. She said she was leaving. I thought she left. The woman started toward the burning building. Two men grabbed her, held her back despite her struggles. And somewhere in the chaos, Caleb heard it, a child's voice, thin and terrified, crying for help from inside. He didn't make a conscious decision. One moment he was standing with the crowd, the next he was running toward the building. Someone grabbed at his arm, Porter maybe, or Sam, he couldn't tell. But he shrugged them off. The front door was already engulfed, but there was a side entrance, smaller and not yet fully caught. Caleb hit it with his shoulder, his good shoulder this time, and the door gave way. Smoke poured out, thick and choking. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth and plunged inside. The interior was a nightmare of smoke and heat. Flames crawled up the walls on the far side, eating their way across wooden beams that cracked and groaned ominously. Visibility was nearly zero. Caleb dropped low, where the air was slightly clearer, and called out, Sarah, where are you? A cough somewhere to his right. He crawled in that direction, feeling his way past overturned desks and scattered books. The heat was intense, sweat already pouring down his face, his eyes streaming. Another cough, closer now. He found her trapped under a fallen bookshelf, her small face streaked with tears and soot. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her eyes wide with terror when she saw him. I've got you, Caleb said, his voice rough from smoke. Hold on. The bookshelf was heavy, made of solid oak, and positioned at an awkward angle. Under normal circumstances, Caleb could have lifted it easily. With one shoulder still healing and smoke choking his lungs, it took everything he had. He braced himself, found the leverage point, and lifted. Pain screamed through his bad shoulder, but he held steady, creating just enough space. Crawl out, he ordered. Fast. Sarah scrambled free, and the moment she was clear, Caleb let the bookshelf drop. His shoulder felt like someone had driven hot metal through it, but there was no time for that. He grabbed the girl, tucked her against his chest, and started back the way he'd come. The smoke had gotten thicker, the heat more intense. Part of the ceiling gave way behind them, sending up a shower of sparks. Caleb stumbled, caught himself, kept moving. His lungs were burning, each breath like inhaling fire. Sarah had her face buried against him, her small body shaking with coughs. The door seemed impossibly far away, and for one terrifying moment, Caleb thought he'd gotten turned around, that they were heading deeper into the fire rather than out of it. Then fresh air hit his face. Someone had opened the door wider from outside, and hands were reaching for them, pulling them clear. They tumbled out into the evening air. Someone took Sarah from him immediately, her mother's sobs of relief cutting through the general chaos. Caleb collapsed to his hands and knees, coughing violently, his lungs trying to expel the smoke he'd inhaled. His shoulder was agony, his vision swimming, but Sarah was safe. That was what mattered. Doc Harrison appeared, checking Sarah first, then turning his attention to Caleb. "Can you stand?" "Yeah." Caleb let the doctor help him up, swaying slightly. The world tilted and spun, but he stayed on his feet through sheer stubbornness. The fire brigade had gotten their water lines established and were working to contain the blaze. It had spread to part of the church roof, but the wind was in their favor, and the surrounding buildings looked like they might be spared. The schoolhouse itself was likely a total loss, but that could be rebuilt. The child was alive. That couldn't be replaced. Sarah's mother appeared in front of Caleb, tears streaming down her face, still holding her daughter. "You saved her. You saved my baby." "Anyone would have—" "No." Her voice was fierce. "No one else went in. You did. You risked your life for my daughter." She grabbed his hand with her free one, squeezed it hard. "Thank you. Thank you." More people were gathering around now, the story spreading through the crowd. The tall stranger who'd run into a burning building without hesitation, who'd pulled a child from certain death, who'd done what needed doing without stopping to calculate risk or consequence. Caleb saw Thomas Blackwood in the crowd, his expression unreadable. Saw Margaret Sutherland standing with her new husband, her face pale and shocked. Saw Sam nodding with something that might have been pride. Saw Porter and Mrs. Patterson and dozens of other faces, all looking at him with something that wasn't judgment or assessment, but recognition. And through the smoke and chaos, he saw Eliza pushing her way forward, her face streaked with tears. She reached him and grabbed his face with both hands, even the damaged one, and pulled him down to eye level. "You absolute idiot," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have died." "But I didn't." He covered her hands with his. "I'm okay." "You're not okay. You're covered in burns and soot, and your shoulder—" She stopped, pulled him into a hug that was probably too tight for his injuries, but that he had no intention of escaping from. "You're not allowed to scare me like that. You're not allowed to die. We have an agreement." "We do?" "Yes, we're going to be together, and you're going to build things, and I'm going to grow things, and we're going to have a life. You don't get to die before we've had that life." She pulled back enough to look at him, and in her eyes he saw fear and love and absolute certainty all mixed together. "Understood?" Around them the crowd had gone quiet, people watching this exchange with varying degrees of surprise and interest. Caleb became aware that he and Eliza had just declared themselves in front of half the town, that there would be talk and speculation, and probably judgment. He found he didn't care at all. "Understood," he said, and kissed her. It wasn't a long kiss. Both of them were too aware of their audience and the ongoing crisis, but it was enough. A declaration and a promise and an answer to all the questions that had been building between them for months. When they pulled apart, someone in the crowd actually applauded. Then more joined in, and suddenly there was actual cheering, people calling out congratulations and well wishes. Not everyone. Caleb saw some disapproving faces, people turning away, but enough. More than enough. Thomas Blackwood stepped forward, and the crowd quieted. He looked at Caleb for a long moment, some internal struggle playing out across his features. Finally, he extended his hand. "That was remarkably brave," he said stiffly. "The town owes you a debt." Caleb shook his hand, surprised. "I just did what needed doing." "Perhaps. But you did it without hesitation when others held back." Blackwood glanced at the ruined schoolhouse, then back to Caleb. "We're going to need to rebuild that in addition to the Brennan building. That's a lot of construction. I could use someone with your strength and skills on the crew if you're interested in the work. It was as close to an apology as Blackwood was probably capable of offering, a public acknowledgement that he'd been wrong, that Caleb had value beyond the gossip and assumptions. Caleb met his eyes steadily. I'm interested, as long as we're clear that I work for Sam Granger and my personal life isn't up for debate. Fair enough. Blackwood nodded, then actually smiled slightly. Besides, seems like your personal life is already well established. He walked away, leaving Caleb and Eliza standing together in the firelight, still holding each other, surrounded by a town that was finally, tentatively, beginning to see them for who they actually were. Doc Harrison insisted on examining Caleb properly, finding minor burns on his hands and arms, but nothing life-threatening. His shoulder had taken another beating, but the doctor grudgingly admitted that Caleb's natural strength had probably saved him from worse injury. You're going to hurt for days, Harrison warned, and I'm serious this time. No heavy work until I clear you. You want to be able to use that arm for the rest of your life? You'll listen. I'll make sure he listens, Eliza promised, and from her tone, Caleb knew she meant it. They walked back through town together as the fire brigade finished their work and the crowd gradually dispersed. People nodded to them, some stopping to offer thanks or congratulations or simple acknowledgement. It wasn't universal acceptance. Caleb knew better than to expect that. But it was a beginning, a foundation to build on. Stay with me tonight, Eliza said quietly when they reached the edge of town where the road forked toward her property. No arguments, no propriety concerns. I need to know you're safe. All right, Caleb agreed, too tired and sore to argue even if he'd wanted to, which he didn't. They walked the mile to her property under emerging stars, the prairie night sounds filling the comfortable silence between them. Tomorrow would bring complications, questions about the fire's cause, rebuilding plans, the ongoing dance of small-town politics and relationships. But tonight, they simply walked together, two people who'd found each other against odds and despite obstacles, building toward a future neither had quite dared to imagine alone. And when they reached Eliza's small house, and she took his hand to lead him inside, Caleb realized with quiet certainty that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for since that first terrible day at the train platform. Not just acceptance or employment or a place to stay, but home. The kind you built rather than inherited, the kind that chose you as much as you chose it, the kind worth staying for, no matter what came next. Morning came softly, pale light filtering through Eliza's kitchen windows to find Caleb already awake, sitting at the table with coffee growing cold in front of him. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, his hands were bandaged where the burns had been worst, and every breath still carried the phantom taste of smoke. But he was alive, and Sarah was alive, and somehow that seemed to have changed everything. Eliza emerged from her bedroom, her hair braided simply for the day ahead, wearing the same practical brown dress she favored for work. She took one look at Caleb's face and poured fresh coffee without comment, joining him at the table. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Slept some. Woke up thinking. He flexed his bandaged hands carefully. About what happens now. Now you heal. Now we rebuild the schoolhouse and the Brennan building. Now life continues. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if the world hadn't fundamentally shifted the night before. Eliza, we kissed in front of half the town. We declared ourselves publicly. That changes things. Does it? She met his gaze steadily. I've cared about you for months. Last night just made it official. I'm not ashamed of that, and I won't pretend to be. I'm not asking you to be ashamed. I'm asking if you've thought about what it means. The talk, the judgment, the way some people will treat you differently because you chose to be with someone like me. Someone like you. Eliza set down her cup with deliberate care. You mean someone brave enough to run into a burning building to save a child? Someone who works honestly and treats people with respect? Someone who's been nothing but kind and patient with me since the day we met? She shook her head. If people want to judge me for that, Caleb, then their judgment tells me more about them than it does about us. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple. She reached across the table, took his hand gently to avoid the burns. I love you. I've probably loved you since the day you built me that one-handed gate latch without making a fuss about it. Everything else is just details we'll figure out as we go. The words hung in the morning air between them, weight and warmth in equal measure. Caleb felt something in his chest crack open, all the careful protection he'd built around his heart finally giving way completely. "I love you too," he said, and the admission felt like laying down a burden he'd been carrying for years. "I've been trying not to, trying to convince myself it was foolish or impossible or would only lead to hurt. But I do. I love you." Eliza smiled, the expression transforming her entire face into something radiant. "Well then, that's settled. Now drink your coffee and let me change those bandages before we head into town. Sam will want to talk about the reconstruction work, and you need to look presentable." The return to practical matters was so quintessentially Eliza that Caleb found himself laughing despite everything. She raised an eyebrow at him. "What's funny?" "You are. We just declared our love for each other, and you're worried about bandages and looking presentable. Love doesn't exempt you from proper wound care." But she was smiling as she said it, gathering the supplies Doc Harrison had left. Besides, the dramatic declarations are lovely, but it's the everyday care that actually matters. Anyone can say pretty words in a moment of crisis. It's the ordinary days that show what you're really made of. She was right, of course. As she carefully unwrapped and cleaned his burns, applying fresh salve with gentle efficiency, Caleb understood that this was love too, not just the grand gestures and passionate moments, but the quiet tending, the showing up, the choosing each other in the mundane reality of daily life. They arrived in town mid-morning to find Main Street buzzing with activity. The schoolhouse ruins were still smoking slightly, being examined by men trying to determine the fire's cause. The Brennan building stood as it had before, damaged but not destroyed, waiting for reconstruction to begin. And everywhere, people were talking about the fire, about the rescue, about Caleb and Eliza's very public declaration. Sam was at his workshop, already sorting lumber and making lists. He looked up when they entered, his weathered face creasing into something approaching a smile. "There's my hero," he said dryly. "How's the shoulder?" "Sore, but functional." Caleb glanced at the lumber stacks. "You're already planning the rebuilds." "Someone has to." Town council met at dawn. They want both buildings reconstructed as quickly as possible. Schoolhouse first, since the children need somewhere to learn. Brennan building can wait a few weeks. Sam set down his pencil, looked at Caleb directly. "Blackwood came by an hour ago. He's serious about wanting you on the crew. Said to tell you he's offering fair wages and the work would run through winter at least. Maybe into spring, depending on how elaborate they decide to make the Brennan rebuild." "What did you tell him?" "That it was your decision, not mine, but that I'd be proud to work alongside you on it." The old carpenter's voice softened slightly. "You did good last night, son. Real good. Showed folks who you actually are, instead of who they assumed you were." The words settled warm in Caleb's chest. He'd spent so long being judged, being found wanting, that simple acknowledgement of his worth felt almost foreign. "I'll do it," he said. "The rebuild work. All of it." "Good. Because I'm getting too old to handle projects this size alone, and I trust you to do them right." Sam pulled out another set of plans. "Now, about the schoolhouse design, the old one was poorly laid out, too many blind corners and only one real exit. I'm thinking we do something better. Multiple exits, wider windows, maybe a bell tower that could serve as a watchtower in emergencies." They spent the next hour planning, and Caleb felt something settle into place inside him. This was what he'd been meant for, not just carpentry as labor, but as craft, as service, as a way of shaping the world into something better and safer. Working with Sam felt right in a way nothing had since before the war, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Eliza had gone to the general store, and when she returned, her face was thoughtful. "You're the talk of the town," she announced. "Half of them want to canonize you, the other half are gossiping about us scandalously, and a few seem to be doing both simultaneously." "And how do you feel about that?" Caleb asked. "Amused, mostly." Mrs. Chen asked when the wedding would be, and Mrs. Harrison wanted to know if I was certain about getting involved with a man of such uncertain prospects, which I thought was rich, coming from someone whose husband drinks away half his income. She set her basket down. Also, Sarah's mother is telling everyone who'll listen that you're a hero, and she's started a petition to have the new schoolhouse named after you. Absolutely not, Caleb said immediately. That's what I told her, but the sentiment is genuine. Eliza came to stand beside him, looking at the plans spread across Sam's workbench. You've become part of this place whether you intended to or not. The question is whether you're ready to accept that. Over the following weeks, Caleb discovered what it meant to be part of a community rather than just passing through it. The schoolhouse reconstruction became a town-wide effort, with volunteers showing up daily to help however they could. Caleb found himself not just building but teaching, showing younger men proper techniques, explaining why certain choices mattered, taking pride in work done right rather than just done fast. Thomas Blackwood proved true to his word, treating Caleb with professional respect and paying fair wages. They would never be friends, their personalities and values were too different, but they developed a working relationship built on mutual capability, if not warmth. And gradually, the social freeze that had threatened after Margaret's wedding thawed. Not completely, not universally, but enough. Margaret herself Caleb saw only once, about 2 weeks after the fire. She was leaving the dressmaker's shop as he was passing by, and for a moment they stood face to face on the boardwalk, the entire history of their failed connection hanging between them. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said stiffly, "I heard about your heroism at the schoolhouse." "Just did what needed doing, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "I owe you an apology for how I treated you when you first arrived and for other things since then. It was unkind and unworthy of me." The apology surprised him. "Water under the bridge, Mrs. Sterling." "Perhaps, but that doesn't make it right." She glanced away, then back. "For what it's worth, I think Eliza Moore is very fortunate. You're a good man, Mr. Hawthorne. I was too foolish to see it." Before Caleb could respond, she'd swept away, leaving him standing on the boardwalk processing the encounter. It wasn't absolution. He didn't need that from her, but it was acknowledgement, a closing of accounts that allowed him to finally set down the weight of that initial rejection. The schoolhouse rose beam by beam, wall by wall, taking shape under the combined efforts of skilled craftsmen and willing volunteers. Caleb worked long days despite his still healing shoulder, finding satisfaction in watching raw materials transform into something useful and beautiful. He incorporated safety features Sam had suggested, wide exits, reinforced supports, windows designed to open easily from inside. Every choice was made with children in mind, with protection and care built into the very structure. "You're good at this," Sam told him one afternoon. They were working on the roof framing, and Sam had been watching Caleb calculate angles and measurements. "Better than good. You've got the mind for it, seeing not just what is, but what could be." "Learned from my father. He always said a carpenter should build for the future, not just the present." "Smart man. He'd be proud of what you're doing here." Sam hammered in another support brace. "Speaking of the future, we should talk about the business." "What about it?" "I'm not getting any younger, Caleb. My hands hurt more days than they don't, and my back's not what it used to be. I can keep working for a few more years, but eventually I'll need to step back." He paused his work, looked at Caleb directly. "I'd like to take you on as a partner. Equal share, equal say in decisions, with the idea that when I do retire, the business becomes fully yours." Caleb nearly dropped his hammer. "Sam, that's incredibly generous, but nothing. You've earned it. You're skilled, reliable, and people trust you, more than they did a few months ago, certainly, but trust builds over time. This town needs good craftsmen, and you're good at the work." Sam returned to his hammering. "Think about it. No rush to decide, but the offer's there. Partnership. A future not just as an employee, but as an owner, someone with stake and standing in the community." It was more than Caleb had dared hope for when he'd first stepped off that train into Margaret Sutherland's horrified gaze. It was a life, real and solid and built on his own merit. That evening, he told Eliza about Sam's offer. They were at her property, where Caleb now spent most of his free time, working on a project of their own. He'd been building her a proper workshop, a small structure near the house where she could do her sewing and crafts with better light and organization than the kitchen table allowed. You should accept, she said immediately. It's a perfect opportunity. It would mean staying permanently, putting down real roots. Is that a problem? She looked up from where she was sorting fabric scraps, her expression curious rather than worried. No, not anymore. Caleb set down his measuring tape, came to sit beside her. For so long I've been running, from the war, from my father's death, from every place that reminded me of what I'd lost. Coming here was supposed to be another fresh start, another chance to try being someone different. But I'm learning you can't build a life on running away. You have to run toward something. And what are you running toward now? You. This place, the work I'm doing, and the people I'm meeting. He took her hand, traced the scars on her palm gently. A future where I don't have to apologize for existing. Then accept Sam's offer. Become his partner. Build that future. Eliza leaned against his shoulder carefully, mindful of his still healing injuries. We'll build it together. Is that a proposal? Maybe. Is that a yes? Caleb laughed, the sound surprised out of him by her directness. Yes, to all of it. Sam's partnership. Staying here permanently. Building a life with you. All of it, yes. Good. She tilted her face up to kiss him, slow and sweet. Now finish that workshop before winter. I have projects planned and I need proper space. The schoolhouse was completed in early October, its bell tower rising proud against autumn skies. The dedication ceremony drew the entire town, children racing around the building while parents and teachers examined every detail. Sarah's mother gave a speech about bravery and community, her daughter standing beside her, still occasionally glancing at Caleb with awe-filled eyes. Principal Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s, inspected the new building with exacting attention before pronouncing it vastly superior to the previous structure in every way. She shook Caleb's hand firmly. You've given us something that will serve children for generations. That's no small gift. After the ceremony, as people gradually dispersed toward the reception being held at the church, Sam pulled Caleb aside. The old carpenter held a small wooden box, polished and clearly well used. My father gave me this when I took over his carpentry business 43 years ago, Sam said, opening the box to reveal a set of fine chisels, their handles worn smooth by decades of use. His father gave them to him when he started out. They've built half the houses in this county at one point or another. He pressed the box into Caleb's hands. Now they're yours. Consider it a partnership gift and a vote of confidence. Caleb looked at the tools, beautiful, practical, meaningful, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. Sam, I can't. These are family heirlooms. And your family now, at least close enough as makes no difference. Sam's gruff exterior cracked slightly, revealing genuine affection beneath. Use them well. Build good things. That's all I ask. They formalized the partnership the following week with papers signed at the lawyer's office and an announcement in the town newspaper. Granger and Hawthorne Carpentry was born, and with it, Caleb's transformation from wanderer to permanent resident was complete. He moved out of Mrs. Murphy's boarding house and into a small cottage Sam helped him buy at favorable terms, close enough to the workshop to walk, but far enough to have privacy. And every evening after work was done, he rode out to Eliza's property. Sometimes there were repairs to do, projects to continue, but mostly they simply spent time together. Cooking, talking, sitting on the porch watching stars emerge, learning each other's rhythms, building the foundation of a shared life. When should we get married? Eliza asked one night in late November. They were in her kitchen, Caleb repairing a cabinet hinge while she worked on a quilt. The question was delivered so casually it took him a moment to process it. Are you proposing to me? Well, you've been too slow about it, so yes, I'm proposing. We love each other. We've already basically declared ourselves to the town, and I'm tired of people asking when we're making it official. She threaded her needle with practiced ease. So, when? Spring? Caleb suggested. After the Brennan building is finished. I'll have more time then, and the weather will be better. Spring works. Simple ceremony, no fuss, just the people who actually matter. She glanced up, smiled. You're sure about this? About me? More sure than I've been about anything in my life. Caleb crossed to her, knelt beside her chair so they were eye level. You saw me when I was convinced I was invisible. You chose me when the world said I was too much. You made me believe I could have a real life here, not just a temporary stopping point. How could I be anything but sure?" "Good answer." She kissed him softly. "Now finish that hinge. I need that cabinet functional." Winter descended on Cottonwood Ridge in earnest, bringing snow and cold that slowed but didn't stop the construction work. The Brennan building progressed steadily, and Caleb found himself taking on more responsibility as Sam's hands troubled him increasingly in the cold. He managed crews, solved problems, made decisions about materials and methods. The work was challenging but satisfying, each completed section a testament to skill and perseverance. He also began taking on custom projects, furniture commissions, specialized repairs, jobs that required not just strength, but artistry. Word spread about his craftsmanship, and people from neighboring towns started seeking him out. The business grew, and with it, Caleb's sense of belonging deepened. One particularly cold December morning, he was working alone in the shop when a woman entered. She was perhaps 60, elegantly dressed despite the weather, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Something about her bearing reminded Caleb of Margaret Sutherland, and indeed, when she introduced herself, the connection became clear. "I'm Eleanor Sutherland, Margaret's mother." She looked around the workshop with evident approval. "I've heard impressive things about your work, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm in need of a new dining table, something large enough to seat 12, but elegant. Can you manage that?" Caleb set down his tools carefully. "I can, yes. But Mrs. Sutherland, given my history with your daughter—" "My daughter is a married woman living her own life, and I am a woman in need of a table." Eleanor's voice was crisp. "What passed between you two is unfortunate but irrelevant to the quality of your craftsmanship. I pay well, and I expect excellence. Can you provide that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then we're agreed. I'll need it by March for a family gathering. Price is negotiable within reason." She handed him a slip of paper with specifications. "One more thing, Mr. Hawthorne. My daughter was foolish to reject you. I told her so at the time, though she wouldn't listen. Sometimes we must learn from our mistakes rather than others' wisdom." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I understand congratulations are in order for your upcoming marriage. Miss Moore, Mrs. Moore, I should say, is a sensible woman. I wish you both well." After she left, Caleb stood holding the specifications, marveling at the strange turnings of life. 6 months ago, he'd been rejected on a train platform, cast out before he'd even had a chance to prove himself. Now he was being commissioned by the mother of the woman who'd rejected him, acknowledged as a craftsman worthy of the town's most prominent families. He told Eliza about it that evening, and she laughed with genuine delight. "Eleanor Sutherland is one of the shrewdest women in the county. If she's commissioning work from you, it means you've truly arrived. She doesn't care what people think. She cares about quality." She paused. "Though I imagine Margaret will have opinions about her mother hiring you." "Not my concern anymore." And Caleb realized he meant it. The rejection that had felt like the end of everything had actually been the beginning, a clearing away of false starts that allowed something real to grow. Winter gave way to spring slowly, the prairie transforming from white to brown to green as warmth returned. The Brennan building was completed in late March, its grand reopening celebrated with speeches and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Blackwood gave Caleb credit publicly, acknowledging his skill and dedication, and the applause that followed was genuine. Eleanor Sutherland's dining table was delivered the same week, and she pronounced it exactly what I wanted with evident satisfaction. She paid promptly and added a generous tip, along with a note saying she'd be recommending Granger and Hawthorne to all her acquaintances. And through it all, Caleb and Eliza prepared for their wedding with quiet determination. They kept it simple as promised, a ceremony at the small church with Sam as Caleb's best man and Mrs., Patterson as Eliza's witness. Porter and his wife attended, along with Doc Harrison, Mrs. Murphy, several of the men Caleb had worked with, and a surprising number of townspeople who'd come to respect them both. Margaret Sutherland did not attend, but she sent a gift, a set of fine linens with a note wishing them happiness. It was more than Caleb had expected and spoke to some growth in her character, some recognition of grace over pride. The ceremony itself was brief and heartfelt. Caleb stood at the altar watching Eliza walk toward him. not in elaborate white, but in a simple blue dress she'd made herself, practical and beautiful, and felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. When the pastor asked if he took this woman, Caleb's "I do" rang clear and certain through the small church. And when Eliza said the same, looking up at him with eyes that held love and laughter and absolute commitment, Caleb understood that all the rejection and pain and wandering had led him exactly where he needed to be. They held a small reception at Eliza's property, their property now, with food contributed by various friends and neighbors. Someone brought a fiddle and there was dancing in the yard, couples spinning under spring sunshine while children ran wild through the new grass. Sam pulled Caleb aside at one point, his weathered face creased in a rare full smile. "You've done well for yourself, son. Built something real." "We built something," Caleb corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, or Eliza, or half the people here. That's the thing about real community. Nobody does it alone. We build each other up, or we all fall down." Sam clapped him on the shoulder. "Now go dance with your wife. I'll handle the well-wishers." Wife. The word still felt new and strange and wonderful. Caleb found Eliza laughing with Mrs. Chen and stole her away for a dance despite his limited skills. She fit perfectly against him, her scarred hand clasped in his bandaged one. Two people marked by life, but not defeated by it. "Happy?" she asked as they swayed to the fiddle's tune. "More than I knew how to be." Caleb looked around at the gathering. The friends they'd made, the community they'd built, the life they'd created through stubbornness and faith and sheer determination. "This is more than I ever thought I'd have. We're not done yet. Still have to finish the workshop, expand the garden, maybe add a room to the house eventually." Eliza's eyes sparkled with plans and possibilities. "Maybe think about children in a year or two, if we're so blessed." Children. Family. A future that stretched out in ordinary, miraculous days, building and growing and simply being. Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Whatever comes, we'll figure it out together." "Damn right we will." As evening approached and guests began departing, Caleb stood on the porch of the home he now shared with Eliza, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The same view he'd seen that first day when he'd come to repair her fence. But everything was different now. He wasn't a stranger anymore, wasn't temporary or uncertain or apologizing for existing. He was home. Had built it board by board, choice by choice, connection by connection. Had learned that strength wasn't just physical but emotional. That courage sometimes looked like staying when running would be easier. That love was both the grand gestures and the daily tending. Eliza joined him, sliding her hand into his, and they stood together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. Tomorrow would bring work, the business to run, the property to maintain, the endless small challenges of building a life. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for recognizing how far they'd both traveled from those early days of pain and isolation. "You know what the best part is?" Eliza said softly. "We don't have to pretend anymore. Don't have to make ourselves smaller or quieter or less than we are. We can just be ourselves fully and honestly, and that's enough." "More than enough," Caleb agreed. "It's everything." And it was. In a small town on the Kansas prairie, a man once rejected for being too tall and a woman scarred by fire had found each other and built something neither could have created alone. Not just a marriage or a business or a home, but a life that fit, strong, patient, and unmistakably their own. The prairie wind carried the scent of growing things and distant rain, promise and possibility in every gust. Somewhere in town, the schoolhouse bell rang to mark the hour, the sound carrying clear across the open land. And in that moment, standing together on the porch they'd repaired and improved and made fully theirs, Caleb Hawthorne understood that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not a place that would accept him despite his height, but people who valued him because of who he actually was. Not a woman willing to overlook his flaws, but a partner who saw them as simply part of the whole person she loved. Not a life of constant apology and minimizing, but one of contribution and pride and belonging. He'd been rejected for being too much. And in that rejection, he'd found his way to a place where he was exactly enough. No more, no less. Just himself. Building, loving, living, in a town that had finally become home in every sense that mattered. As stars began emerging in the deepening twilight, Caleb squeezed Eliza's hand gently. She looked up at him, smiled that smile that still made his heart catch, and together they turned toward the house where lamplight glowed warm and welcoming through the windows. Their house, their life, their future, unfolding one ordinary miraculous day at a time. And that, Caleb thought as they stepped inside together, was more than any letter-writing, hope-filled man could ever have asked for when he'd stepped off that train so many months ago into an uncertain future. It was, quite simply, everything.